much for coming to the TownGreen field trip with Russ Hopping. I'm TownGreen's Executive Director, Maureen Aylward, and we love doing field trips. It gives us a chance to come together to have an educational experience with an expert, and we have Russ Hopping with us from the trustees, which we're thrilled about. And again, it gives us a chance to learn about climate impacts on our area, in our region. And today's field trip that Russ will explain for just a moment, we're hoping to take a look at climate adaptation in this area. So, Russ.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. And we certainly picked the right day, right? It feels more like April, late April, than it does March, mid-March. So yes, I'm going to just explain a little bit about salt marsh history and the Great Marsh that surrounds us here, and the restoration techniques that we're going to be looking at, that the trustees and its partners have been implementing for a few years now. Leave all this behind, but it's going to be fun to get out there and actually see the work that's been done and the impact that it is having. We started this work 2016. We realized that it would be beneficial for the trustees to take a look at the impact of the projected sea level rise as a result of climate change, climate warming, and what impacts it may have on not only our ecological resources, but access and our cultural resources along the coast. And no surprise, I guess, but came back with, one of the areas that's probably going to change the most is our salt marshes. And in this case here at the Great Marsh, we're looking at a 25,000 acre ecosystem that includes the salt marshes, the barrier beaches, so Crane Beach, Plum Island, etc. There is a relationship there, right? If you don't have the barriers, you don't have the salt marsh. And then the tidal waters and mud flats in between. That whole thing is kind of functioning as one. That's the Great Marsh ecosystem. So we started thinking about, well, what is the condition of our marshes? Prior to that, we really didn't do much with salt marshes. We just thought, yep, they're green, they're there, they're doing great. Not a lot of recreation out there, and our priorities are elsewhere, such as piping plovers, for example, on the beach. Well, lo and behold, turns out they weren't doing as well as we thought they were, and we began to look around to think about, well, what, if any, intervention can we do to make these salt marshes more resilient to what's coming? So in a way, it's already happening, and we're going to see some of that when we go out there. But the models are projecting it's going to get a lot worse. What's getting worse? Sea level rise is going to get higher and probably at a faster rate. The whole trick to this whole restoration is how can we intervene to make the marshes most resilient to be able to keep pace with that sea level rise before they get overtaken. What Jim is holding is just a very kind of big picture to set the stage. For one, on the left is the Great Marsh in concept anyway. So that's that 25,000 acre ecosystem, just showing you the barrier islands, the salt marsh, etc. That is the scale we would like to work at. So not a few acres here, a few acres there. That's the vision that we see, this whole ecosystem. The other map there is just simply highlighting some of the protected land, the orange being the trustees, purple Mass Wildlife, and I believe green is Essex County Greenbelt, and some federal and state land there. So those are prioritizing the areas for our third phase. You see all these tracks written here. There's 19 tracks. So all those areas outlined in blue is our phase 3. But that's the scale, again, that we're working at. We have 3 phases to this. Phase 1 was done at Old Town Hill in Newbury. That was 85 acres. That was the first project we started on. Phase 2 includes land on Mass Wildlife Marsh up at Bill Forward Wildlife Management Area, William Forward up in Newbury, and then 132 acres here on either side of Argilla Road, which we're going to walk down to, and then 111 acres nearby over in Essex. So that's the phase 2, and then phase 3 is about just over 1,000 acres. So the goal was scale up as much as we can. You get a lot more impact, obviously, with the larger the project, and you lower those costs. and we can talk a little bit more about those later on. So even though these are the trustees-led projects, we're doing this in conjunction with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service over at Parker River National Wildlife Refuge, Mass Wildlife. They're the second largest marsh owner, trustees, and then Essex County Greenbelt, which is the third largest marsh owner in the Great Marsh ecosystem. Those four organizations, if you will, own and protect 50% of the Great Marsh. So it's about 8,000 acres. So that was our initial scale with the partners. We said, well, we can at least begin to think about this at an 8,000 acre scale. We certainly want to go beyond that. This is the actual restoration plan for the 132 acres here. But what you're looking at here, so the outline in white is the actual 132 acres. Then the red lines are the old agricultural embankments that the farmers created. The green and the blue lines are those ditches that the farmers then made as well, together with the embankments. Starting in the 1600s, certainly throughout the 1700s, and then through the 1800s, the farmers manipulated and altered all the salt marsh pretty much, not just the Great Marsh in Massachusetts, but certainly here. We're not finding any areas that haven't been altered at this point. But what they did is they wanted to increase agricultural productivity. So they started to drain the marsh so it would drain faster, if you will. And then they would put up these embankments or berms that would eventually keep the tides from actually flooding certain areas of the marsh. And those ditches would drain surface water, groundwater, any flood tides that might get over it through that system, out through those embankments, and they were able to increase agricultural productivity, sometimes by 3 times as much. So if you can imagine 1 ton of hay, salt marsh hay off of an acre, once they were able to do all these agricultural alterations, they were able to get up to 3 tons. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Along comes the internal combustion engine. You really don't need all that fodder and bedding. You get 1 crop off the marsh a year where the uplands had already all been cleared. You can get 2 to 3 crops off of upland hay. So the first thing to go when there was not much demand for hay anymore was the salt marshes. Farmers walked away from all that infrastructure. They didn't do anything to it. Prior to that, they were keeping that infrastructure up every single time they were out there, right? Clear this ditch, fix that, tide gate, that kind of thing. It was worth it to them. So then what happened is all that fell apart. The system began to fall apart, began to hold a lot of water. That's when it got known as, marshes aren't good for anything but breeding all these salt marsh mosquitoes, right? There was a lot of water on there. Then came along WPA programs, Works Project Association or administration, I guess, but then also mosquito control to drain off all that ponding water that was happening as a result of that, farmers walking away from that infrastructure. Fast forward a few decades, here we are, right? The marsh is going through something similar. So farmers created a lot more ditches per acre, so to speak, than there would have been natural creeks. In doing so, anytime you expose peat, which is what the marsh is built on, and it's not flooded, it's exposed to air. So once air gets to it, it starts that decomposition process. Peat is made up, salt marsh peat is made up to 80% undecomposed organic material. It's the plants. All those salt marsh grasses out there have to grow every single year. That's a lot of material. Then it dies, and then new vegetation grows every year. Together with some incoming sediment, all of that material is sequestered away from oxygen, and it helps build the marsh. Once you dig a ditch through it, you expose it to oxygen, you start that decomposition process. It doesn't build either as much or it actually subsides. It's going in the wrong direction when we have sea level. The second thing that's happening is where all of those ditches are getting clogged, the water is staying on the marsh. And then you're seeing the groundwater in that marsh come up to the surface. When it sits at the surface or just below, it kills off all the marsh grass. Those are wetland plants that are adapted to a tidal cycle. They're not aquatic plants. They do not want to grow in standing water. As a result, they die. You lose that biomass, the marsh sinks in those places. So in both trajectories, you're losing elevation and gain when we're actually seeing, when we need the opposite. We need to have the marsh be building as much as possible to keep up with sea level rise. What's the solution? So several things. Ditches, we're remediating through what we call ditch remediation, and this is harvesting salt marsh grass next to the ditches we are remediating. Again, all of the green lines on that map are the ditches we will remediate. The blue lines are the ditches we're leaving. We can't get rid of all the ditches because the marsh needs to flood and drain, right? Normally there would have been all these little creeks. Those creeks are gone. The farmers got rid of them all. They filled them in and created all those straight lines. We're not trying to recreate all those natural sinuous creeks. We're using the existing infrastructure to replicate the natural process that a marsh would have in terms of flooding and draining. So this is a representation of that. Over a 3-year period, the hay is cut, moved into the ditch, pushed down in, secured with twine and wooden stakes. And it just needs to be secured long enough for a couple of weeks, really, for it to get wet enough and compacted enough. Every incoming tide twice a day is bringing in sediment that's suspended in that water. As it flows through these ditches over that grass, that sediment drops out and starts to fill in all that space in between the salt marsh hay. We're essentially trying to rebuild the marsh peat that was there as fast as we can, using the same ingredients, if you will, that would normally do it. The average ditch takes about 3 years. So we have to do it over a 3-year period. You're going to see the results of 2 years of this treatment when we go out there. In addition to what I said about why we're not treating all of the ditches, is the remaining ditches, they'll serve as what we're calling primary or single channel hydrology. And by closing up the other ones or healing them, the water that would have been going through those now has to go through the remaining ditches. And what that does is it forces the sediment that's dropping out and clogging all these ditches to now be forced through that ditch, and on the most extreme tides, mostly storm tides, it's flushing it out onto the marsh surface where it is needed to build that elevation. And that's exactly how a natural marsh would have worked. So where those clogs occur, and we're seeing this happen on lots of the marsh. I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres. We need to facilitate the draining of that marsh, the water off of the surface, and lower the groundwater down below 10 centimeters to turn back on the optimum growing condition for the marsh grasses. Once we can do that, you now have the basic building block, again, producing all that organic material that creates the peat. And then it also, when the marsh floods, you have grass that can slow down that flood water and trap the sediment. Question being is, does it help with carbon sequestration? So that peat, that 80% undecomposed organic matter, that's all carbon. So marshes can sequester up to 10 times more carbon than a forest. We have 45,000 acres of salt marsh in Mass. So, you know, that's a lot of carbon, and we're losing it pretty fast. And some people would ask me, well, won't sea level rise create more salt marsh as the sea level rise? Well, it will, but the topography here is such that you're going to lose far more than you will gain. It's not like further south on the coastal plain where it just goes in for, you know, miles and miles and miles. You hardly have any gain. Here you can have, and we'll see it out there, our islands, you know, they abruptly come up out of the marsh. That's because a lot of these islands around here are drowned drumlins. It's the tops of the drumlins, and the marsh has developed in between. So we don't have that advantage they do down south. That's a good thing in some ways, but we're gonna see very little marsh created compared to what we have as a result of marsh migration.